Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are going to grab the third rail of conversation and hold on tight. We aren't talking about politics or the economy. We're talking about God, religion, and the very specific, very controversial idea that God might not be out there in the universe at all. Instead, we're asking, what if God is strictly a construct inside our heads? What if every prayer, every ritual, and every cathedral is actually a symptom of a universal mental illness born from a psychological struggle we all share?
It is a heavy premise. I mean, we're looking at religion through the lens of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, and his take is essentially that religion is an obsessional neurosis. He traces the history of God from a primal murder in prehistory all the way to the rise of monotheism, arguing that our belief is basically a coping mechanism for guilt, fear, and, well, daddy issues on civilization-wide scale.
It is the ultimate detective story, where the suspect is the human mind. To do this, we are diving into a stack of Freud's most significant and, frankly, most provocative works. Totem and Taboo, The Future of an Illusion, Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices, and his final mic drop of a book, Moses and Monotheism.
Our mission today is to deconstruct religious belief not as divine truth, but as psychological machinery. We're looking at how humanity uses these beliefs to deal with the repression of our darkest instincts.
Right. And before we start diagnosing all of humanity, I just have a quick request. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
So shall we dive into the symptoms first?
Let's do it. So Freud doesn't start with burning bushes or parting seas. He starts with something way more clinical, obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Right. In 1907, he wrote a paper called Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices. He was treating neurotic patients in Vienna who had these rigid private rituals. Maybe they had to touch a door frame 3 times, or they had to arrange their pillows in a perfect geometric grid before they could sleep.
And if they didn't do it?
Panic. Absolute dread. They felt pangs of conscience, as if they'd committed a crime. Freud looked at these patients, and then he looked at religious people, kneeling, chanting, following strict dietary laws, and he had this aha moment. He realized that structurally these two things are identical.
Hang on, though. That feels like a bit of a stretch. You're saying a guy counting his steps is the same as a priest performing high mass?
In terms of the psychological mechanism, yes. Freud breaks it down. First, there's the isolation. You usually have to stop your normal life to perform the ritual. Second, the perfectionism. You cannot deviate from the script, or the prayer loses its power. And third, the displacement of value. In both neurosis and religion, petty details like exactly how you wash your hands or which direction you face become matters of life and death.
Okay, I can see the structural parallel, but usually we think of mental illness as a private struggle. Religion is a community thing.
That is the only real difference Freud grants. He calls neurosis a private religion that you invent for yourself to deal with your own specific trauma. And he calls religion a universal obsessional neurosis. It's just a shared set of symptoms that everyone agrees on.
But symptoms of what? Why do we do it?
This is a core insight. In psychoanalysis, a ritual is never just a habit, it's a defense mechanism. It's a wall you build to hold back a repressed instinct, usually a sexual or violent one.
There was a specific case study in the notes that really drove this home for me. The story about the red ink. It sounded completely bizarre.
It's classic Freud. So he has a patient, a woman who has this compulsion where she runs from room to room in her house. She finds a table, calls her maid over, and then spills red ink over the tablecloth.
Which sounds completely random. Why ruin a tablecloth?
Exactly. But Freud digs into her history. It turned out, on her wedding night years prior, her husband was impotent. He couldn't perform. In those days, a lack of blood on the sheets the next morning was a public humiliation. It implied the marriage wasn't consummated.
So the husband poured red ink on the bed to fake it.
He did.
Yeah.
To save face. And years later, this woman is compulsively reenacting that moment. She is fixing the shameful reality of her husband's failure. The ritual manages the anxiety of that repressed memory.
That is wild. So she's running around staining tables to cover up a sexual secret.
Precisely. Now apply that logic to religion. If the red ink is a cover-up for sexual shame, what is the Holy Communion or the call to prayer covering up?
Freud thinks they're covering up our socially harmful instincts.
Yes. Humans are naturally violent, jealous, and sexually aggressive. Society says no to these things. We repress those urges, but they don't go away. They just go underground. So we invent holy rituals, sacrifices, prayers, penance to keep those dark instincts at bay. We manage our guilt through the ceremony.
Okay, but this implies there is something specific we all feel guilty about. If religion is a universal neurosis, there has to be a universal trauma. We didn't all have that woman's husband.
No. We had the primal father.
This is where we pivot to totem and taboo. And I have to say, this part reads less like a psychology textbook and more like a horror movie.
It's very Darwinian. Freud theorizes that early humans lived in what he calls a primal horde. This wasn't a happy democratic village. It was a violent hierarchy. At the top was the primal father. He was the alpha. He kept all the females for himself and violently drove his sons away to prevent any competition.
So you have a landscape filled with these bands of exiled, sexually frustrated, angry sons roaming the wilderness.
Exactly. And one day, the brothers organized. They realized that while the father was stronger than any one of them individually, he wasn't stronger than all of them together.
Yeah.
So they returned. They overpowered him, and they killed him.
The primal parasite.
And then they ate him.
Cannibalism. Just to be clear, because this is important for later, this wasn't for nutrition, right? They weren't just hungry.
No, it was symbolic. In the savage mind Freud's term, you consume what you want to become. By eating the father, they believed they were absorbing his strength and his power. They wanted to be him.
So the tyrant is dead. The sons are in charge. They have the power. Problem solved.
You would think so. But this is where psychology complicates history. Freud introduces the concept of ambivalence. This is crucial to understanding everything that follows regarding God.
Ambivalence doesn't just mean I'm not sure, right?
Right. In psychoanalysis, it means holding two opposing, powerful emotions at the exact same time. The sons hated the father for his tyranny, yes, but they also admired him. They loved him. He was their ideal.
So once the adrenaline of the murder wears off,
The hate recedes and the love comes crashing back. But now it's curdled into massive, crushing guilt. They are terrified of what they've done. To deal with this guilt, they create the first religious structures. They choose a totem, usually an animal, to stand in for the dead father.
and they set up two rules, the two fundamental taboos of humanity.
Rule 1, you cannot kill the totem animal, which symbolizes we will not repeat the murder of the father,
And rule 2, you cannot have sex with the women of the clan.
which implies we will not take the prize the father denied us. This is the incest taboo. Freud argues that our entire moral code, don't kill, don't commit incest, isn't divine law sent from heaven. It's a prehistoric reaction to a murder we committed thousands of years ago. It's a never-again policy.
It is mind-blowing to think that our morality is basically a guilt trip. But here's the weird part that I struggled with in the reading. They promised not to kill the totem, except for when they did.
The totem meal. Freud found this fascinating. Once a year, the clan would gather, kill the sacred totem animal, and eat it.
It's a festival.
A festival is, by definition, a permitted excess. It's a time when the normal rules don't apply. They reenact the murder to remember their triumph and bond with each other. But, and this is the tell, immediately after the feast, they mourn, they wail and cry over the dead animal.
It's that cycle of ambivalence again. We killed him, we are powerful. Oh God, we are so sorry.
Precisely. It's a cycle of gratification and guilt. And Freud traces how this evolved. Stage 1 was the totem animal. Stage 2, as society advanced, the animal was replaced by human gods. And finally, Stage 3, the single male god.
So God is just the primal father projected onto the sky.
Essentially, yes. As the family structure evolved and the father regained authority in the household, the memory of the primal father was exalted into a deity. God is the father.
And Freud doesn't stop there. He draws a direct line to Christianity. And for anyone listening who is religious, this is probably the most challenging part of his theory.
It is. Freud analyzes the Christian Eucharist communion through this totem lens. He argues it is a literal return of the totem meal. Think about the theology. The Son, Christ, sacrifices himself to atone for the original sin.
And in Freud's view, the original sin isn't Adam eating an apple.
No. The original sin is the Son's killing the Father. The Son gives his life to pay for that primal murder. But then what do the believers do? They eat the flesh and blood of the Son.
So communion is a replay of the cannibalistic feast.
That is the argument. It's a way of incorporating the divine, just like the primal horde absorbed the Father. Christianity, in Freud's view, acknowledges the primal crime more openly than other religions by having the Son die, but it also repeats the act of eating the God.
That is heavy. But we have to move to the final piece of the puzzle, because Freud didn't just look at general religion. He looked specifically at Judaism and monotheism in his book Moses and Monotheism.
This was his last book, written while he was fleeing the Nazis. It is his most controversial work by far.
And the theory starts with a massive twist. Moses wasn't Jewish.
Correct. Freud argues that the name Moses is Egyptian. He suggests that Moses was actually an Egyptian noble, a high-ranking follower of the pharaoh Akhenaten.
Akhenaten was that famous heretic pharaoh who tried to force Egypt to worship only one god, the Aten or the sun disk.
Right. Akhenaten was the first true monotheist. But when he died, Egypt violently rejected his religion and went back to the old gods. Freud speculates that Moses, a true believer in the one God, saw his world collapsing. So he found a Semitic tribe living in Egypt, the Jews, and decided to lead them out to create a new nation dedicated to this strict, abstract, one-God religion.
So the Exodus wasn't just an escape from slavery. It was an Egyptian priest trying to save his religion by transplanting it to a new people.
Exactly. But here's the tragic twist. Freud suggests that the strict laws and the high demands of this Egyptian Moses were too much for this unruly Semitic tribe. They rebelled, and in a reenactment of the primal parricide, they killed Moses.
They killed their liberator.
Freud believes they did. And then, just like in the primal horde, they repressed the memory. They covered it up. They merged the memory of Moses with another local volcano god, Yahweh, and tried to forget the murder ever happened.
But as we know from the lady with the red ink, you can't repress things forever.
No. And this brings us to the concept of the latency period. Freud uses the analogy of a train wreck. Imagine someone is in a terrible train crash. They walk away without a scratch. They seem fine. But weeks later, they develop shakes, nightmares, insomnia. That is the latency period. The trauma takes time to incubate.
So the Jewish people had a train wreck moment when they killed Moses.
Yes. They forgot the strict monotheism and the murder for centuries,
Yeah.
but the guilt was festering in the unconscious. And centuries later, it returned. It erupted in the form of the great prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah. They brought back the strict ethical monotheism of Moses with a vengeance.
The return of the repressed.
Exactly. They embraced the one God who demands absolute obedience and moral perfection because they were unconsciously driven by the massive guilt of having killed the father Moses. The stricter the religion, the more it proves the guilt.
And this gives a psychological explanation for the chosen people narrative, doesn't it?
It does. Freud analyzes that as a psychological boost. If you believe the all-powerful Father chose you specifically, it gives you a sense of grandeur. It's like a child who believes their dad is the strongest man in the world. It protects them. It boosted their narcissism, their self-esteem, allowing them to survive terrible persecution because they believed they possessed the ultimate truth.
Speaking of persecution, Freud also touches on anti-Semitism in these texts, and he gives it a twist that I hadn't heard before.
He does. He argues that hostility toward Jews has a few psychological roots. Partly, it's jealousy. If a group claims to be the firstborn favorite of the father, the other siblings, other nations, are going to be jealous.
That makes sense in a family dynamic.
But he adds a darker layer regarding Christian anti-Semitism. He calls it badly christened. He argues that many European peoples were forced into Christianity at sword point. Underneath, they remained barbaric polytheists. They hated the new religion imposed on them, but they couldn't attack Christianity directly, so they projected their hatred onto the source of Christianity, the Jews. They hate the Jews because they unconsciously hate the strict moral restrictions of the religion that came from them.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole picture. We have covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Freud's argument is that religion isn't a revelation from the heavens. It's a projection from the nursery.
Yes, God is the Father. The ritual is the way we manage our guilt. The doctrine is the neurosis. It's the Oedipus complex, written on a cosmic scale. We killed the Father, we feel guilty, so we worship him and obey his rules to make up for it.
So what does this mean for the atheist? Or just for the future of humanity? If religion is just a childhood neurosis, do we grow out of it?
That is Freud's hope, specifically in his book, The Future of an Illusion. He argues that humanity is like a child growing up. We cannot stay in the nursery forever. We cannot rely on the comforting illusion of a benevolent Father God who will protect us from the scary universe.
We have to leave the parental house.
We have to face reality. We have to face the cold, indifferent universe with the tools of science and reason, not the omnipotence of thoughts and wish fulfillment of religion. He admits it's painful. It is colder outside the nursery, but it's the only way to mature.
It's a stark view. But it's also a call to courage. It's asking us to stop wishing for a protector and start dealing with reality on its own terms.
It is.
Yeah.
It asks us to look at our beliefs and ask, is this true? Or is this just what I need to be true to feel safe?
And I think that leads us to a final provocative thought for everyone listening.
Indeed. Freud mentions a famous Latin phrase, credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. He suggests that the intensely strong belief people have in religious dogmas, things that defy all logic, doesn't come from proof. It derives its power entirely from the unconscious memory of a forgotten truth,
The truth of the murder.
the murder of the father. So the question we leave you with is this. Is your belief actually faith? Or is it a repressed memory of a primal crime bubbling up from the darkest corners of human history?
Something to think about while you sleep tonight. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Until next time.